Hello, everybody. We're back. We're joined again by Elliott, and it's time to get theoretical in that brainy, real theory shit kind of way. It's a Sunday, so happy Sunday to everyone. St. Francis Sunday. So if to those of you who celebrate St. Francis Sunday, hug your dogs and your cats and talk to the trees and preach to the birds and all those St. Francis-y things. Today, we're going to talk about nothing, but we don't mean no thing. We mean nothingness. So Elliott has quite generously allowed me to force him to read one of the greatest Christian thinkers, in my opinion. Definitely one of the greatest Christian thinkers of the past 100 years or so, Karl Barth, and who was a Swiss Reformed theologian. Wrote a ton of stuff. I would never claim to be a Barth expert. I'm not. I'm a great admirer of Barth, though. And he wrote this multi-volume, massively insane work called Church Dogmatics, and it is about as dense as it sounds. There's lots. He talked about a lot of stuff. I have not read all of Church Dogmatics. Some people do. Those are people who usually devote their whole lives to studying Karl Barth. I have, however, read individual sections, excuse me, of Karl Barth, of the Church Dogmatics, and there's one that I think is going to be a lot of fun to talk about. That's what we're going to talk about today, which is his whole section talking about nothingness, or in German, das Nichtige. God and Nothingness is the name of the section. Yeah, so before I attempt to briefly summarize the entire thing, because that's going to be a trip. Elliott, I hope you're doing well.
Yeah.
How was this for you? I'm just curious, as from a reader response perspective, how was this reading this? Because the first time I cracked this open, I kind of didn't know exactly what was going on. And the second time I read it through, it made a lot more sense. I don't know, like, what, I'm just curious. Your general, either how you felt while reading it, or just your general reactions to either Barth's thoughts, but maybe more generally his writing style, his thinking style. I know you have a lot to say about this, so.
No, for sure.
Yeah.
Right. And so a couple of thoughts. So as you pointed out, and I think it's worth mentioning right before I kind of go on a little mini polemic, not actually polemic, but friendly polemic. How about that? Is that, hey, this is like one chapter in like one book in like a huge series of whatever the heck. So fair enough. We're flying in, like, I'm flying in with little context, with highly technical language, which is cool. You know what I mean? Like I'm also down with sort of realizing that there's lots of technical language that was defined elsewhere, and I'm like, okay, I'll just kind of go with the general vibe or spirit of the piece and not get too like whatever I disagree with that word about it. So just so that other people know, like I'm not speaking like I didn't understand what he was saying because he didn't define all his terms, because I know he defined it elsewhere. Basically, I'm just saying that my general vibe when reading theologians, and really anybody, honestly, who is writing in the early half of the 20th century, right, of just, there is a prose back then that even mathematicians, when I read them, I'm like, what the heck are you saying? Why did you spend a paragraph saying this when you could have just said it way simpler, right? So that's one thing for me. And the other thing that I brought up, and we don't really have to address this, is that I'm always of this thought where I read Christian theologians and I'm like, dude, like, we're not actually expending any knowledge here. This is just another tautological way of reaffirming the qualities of God that we already agreed to earlier in the argument, right? Which isn't necessarily a bad thing, but that's just my impression.
No, I mean, I think, excuse me, we were talking about before we started recording. I don't know if I necessarily disagree with that, right? I think it's like as I'll retell the joke here. Autiste, the autist in me recognizes the autist in you. Yes, like, wow,
exactly.
geez, it's like Karl Barth's kind of on the spectrum, and he's like, yeah, I know. And what else do you have to say? Because that's like the first thing that jumps out of you. You're like, wow, this guy like can really go deep and go.
Takes one to know one.
It takes one to know one. It really does. Yeah, it really does. Personally called out, something like that. Insert internet meme here, right? Like, yes.
Right.
No, I mean, I think that's. I think you also, to give you some credit, though, you also mentioned that is part from a Christian, when a Christian is reading Christian theology, sort of like,
Yes.
internally, that is part of the goal of theology, at least in a scholastic, like, medieval sense of, like, theology is. It is to refine our understanding of the divine as much as we can, but ultimately there's sort of a pastoral function as well, at least in good theology. I would argue, and many others would argue,
Yes.
there's a pastoral function in that this is a way of worshiping God, but also acquiring a closer relationship with God. There's something mystical about it, but it's also guiding people who read this thing, right, that you publish and you hope somebody reads at some point. Although when Barth was writing, people were reading him contemporaneously, so he was kind of a big deal. You hope, right? A theologian hopes that people, when they read this, they experience God in a meaningful way, even if it's just conceptually, but perhaps more.
Right. And actually, if I can offer, I just thought of this. If I can offer kind of a maybe an allegory, right?
Please.
Is that are you familiar with the difference between a maze and a labyrinth?
Not really, except a labyrinth has David Bowie in the center. And so
yes, exactly, right.
No, sorry, you set that one up. No, please elucidate.
Exactly, right. So it's a good joke. It's a good joke. It helps us punch up the theoriness of us. But no, so a maze.
We like Bowie here. This is a Bowie friendly space, so please continue. Yeah.
Without getting too technical, right? But without trying to lose like the real definition of it, a maze is something in which you could get lost, and a labyrinth is impossible to get lost in. So that is to say, a labyrinth has exactly one path that's bent around a bunch, right? That has a start and a finish. That start and finish can be on the quote exterior, but it could also be on the interior. A maze has multiple branching pathways that if you take the wrong one, you will not escape, right? So like in theory, science is like a maze, right? Because you're trying to figure out what is real, and what's real has branching paths where theoretically, scientific theory has dead ends where you're like, well, I'm not getting to the truth here, so I got to back up and try again. Whereas theology in theory should be a labyrinth, right? It should be a meditative exercise where you know where the end point is, you know where the starting point is, and everything else is just a convoluted path to get from point A to point B. The simplest labyrinth would be God is God, done, right? Worship him through Christ, game over. The more complicated labyrinths have like all sorts of ways of sort of picking up additional points that you're like, well, is that point God? And you're like, nope, let's go through that point to get to God. And since we haven't gotten to God yet, it's not God, right? Like, so that can maybe be a decent way of kind of the way I feel about it. So
no, that's a very good way of describing it. Yes. Thank you. I think that definitely helps me think about it differently, and I'm certain it will help viewers think about it differently as well. Okay. Yeah. So yeah. I think that's probably a good, thank you, Elliott. You just did it for me. A really good introduction to what we're trying to do here. To go full autist and go and just dive right in. I, as somebody who is fluent in German, it would be remiss of me to not mention, just as a side note, perhaps, that this is all a translation. We read the translation, the English translation. I was nice to Elliott and gave him the English translation because you should not be cruel. I will say Barth's German prose is outstanding. Translation here is quite good, but the original German is even better. Obviously, you have to have years of German experience to really get into it. It's not easy reading. It's not first year German. Why do I point that out? Aside from it just being something to know, this concept of nothing, or what Barth calls nothingness, I would like to spend a few minutes just talking about that, because it is a translation of a German term, and actually the translators, to give them all due credit, they make a point about talking about this. So the German word for nothingness that Barth uses is das Nichtige. Das Nichtige is a very difficult term to translate. because they've chosen the term here nothingness, which I don't think is a bad translation. It's good, it works, right? But very rarely is there a one-to-one translation, particularly for terms that are sort of made up or used on the spot, right? So Barth is very inventive with his German, and German as a language does allow you to be quite creative with making like theoretical words to talk about theoretical things. Das Nichtige could be and is translated here as nothingness, but it could also be like the translators point out, it could be, you could technically translate it as like the nullity, or like the nullifying thing, the thing which negates everything. So you're talking about, it's Jesus, Barth's talking about very specific things in a very specific way. If you be glad that this was translated, is what I'm trying to say, because if you go into the German, you have to figure this out on two more levels. But when Barth talks about nothingness, he's talking about the sort of unthing, the unthing that should not be a thing and is not really a thing, but because everything else is, because God makes everything else and sustains everything else that is, it is the thing that is not, but yet somehow has been, paradoxically, in opposition to God and God's creation. So that is, again, I would never claim to be a Barth expert, but as somebody who has a passing knowledge of Barth, really appreciates Barth, and does speak German, I can sort of put a small expert hat on, not a big expert, not a top hat, but a small, like an expert ball cap.
Expert yarmulke.
Like, yes, it's like, so it's the thing that nullifies. So when Barth talks about nothingness, and when we're talking about nothingness in this episode, what Barth means, and by extension what we mean, is the aspect, the sort of non-aspect, the unaspect of creation that strives against what is. And so that can be against God's creation, right? Because God's creation exists. It is totally a thing, as they say. Res autem vero est. It is totally a thing. That's actually a Latin phrase, and it's just that's Neo-Latin, but it's totally a thing. It exists.
Neo-Latin,
right? Yeah.
Warhammer 40K over here.
Warhammer 40K Latin. Actually, the grammar checks out on that. Yeah. It's totally a thing. Creation is a thing, but creation is from a Christian perspective, and from, I would argue, a broadly speaking theist perspective in general, right?
Yes.
Creation is because of something else that's supernatural, right? Whatever, and there's lots of different, of course, beliefs and theories about that. But Barth's writing from a Christian perspective, specifically a Reformed, so he was Swiss Reformed, from a Reformed perspective, so very Protestant perspective. So creation is, so nothingness strives against creation. Creation exists, but ultimately creation only exists because God is the ground of all creation, right? God is and was and will be before and above all creation. So ultimately, this is important. Let me just, ultimately, yeah. Nothingness strives against creation, but only because it strives against God ultimately. So creation suffers because of nothingness's war against he who ultimately is, capital I, capital S, who is God, particularly from a Christian perspective here. So,
and I want to point out that, like, and I'm going to be bringing in a couple of different math concepts. They're not going to be crazy or anything.
You do it. I want your math. I want your math, because I don't have the math. I want your math. Drop some math on us.
All right, we're going to be dropping some math here. So
watch your toes, everyone. Math is being
when I hear the word supernatural, right? Obviously, super from the Latin is above, right? Over, yeah. And so over, right? And that's great too. So basically, think about super like if you've heard of the math term superset and subset, right? Superset is something that a superset B of a set A totally contains A, right? So let's say every element of A is an element of B. So you've just redefined a sub collection of your initial collection. That's the superset of it, right? So it's one thing. And then the other way I think about super is in terms of supremum, right? So a supremum in real analysis, right, which is the analysis of real numbers, is essentially the point at which you are the lowest upper bound to the thing you're talking about. So it's sort of like, I'm not touching you, I'm not touching you. What is that point? It might be in the set, right? You might actually have to touch the set to get that lowest upper bound, right? Or if the set is open, so to speak, then you know you could get that point outside of the set. But the point, either way, there's this mirror concept called the infimum, right, which is the greatest lower bound, right? So it's just like the lowest upper bound, just in the opposite direction. And so from this thought, I kind of think we talk about nature and supernatural, right? But we don't really talk about infinatural, right? Or infranatural, if that makes sense. And I would reckon that, like, I've thought about this a tiny bit. The infranatural, in my mind, is stuff like math and language, you know, the things that kind of undergird nature that are not really part of nature proper. But anyway, not the point. That's just kind of go ahead.
It's a good point, because I will use that. This is the lovely aspect of talking about these things, because we get to yes and each other, like D&D or in improv comedy. It's all a yes and. I will yes and you in a few minutes here, because Bart touches on, not on math per se. I mean, he's not doing math, but he touches on a very maybe a theological equivalent of what you were just talking about. So
perfect. And then another thing I want to bring up, just to kind of like, so a little bit of a tangent, but actually I think it's very important before we go too much further, because he and what we're trying to do here is we're trying to talk about the difference of a few different things, right? So there's, in my mind, there's a very clear distinction between truth and false and real and unreal, right? And some examples of this as a true thing is that square root of 2 is a real number, is an irrational number. That is a true statement. You know, a false statement is a set can be contained within itself, right? That turns out to be just a mathematical paradox. We can explain that later if that does, you know, it's relevant to reality, by the way. It's actually quite important, because it means that God cannot be contained within himself, assuming that some stuff, right? And so that's a false statement. It necessarily is false. There's unreal things like unicorns, right? Or the
you don't know, the truth is out there, man. You don't know.
Well, and see, that's why I bring up unicorns, right? Because it's in principle could be a thing. It just happens not to be. It's accidentally a thing, if we're being Aristotelian.
Elliott, you can say that, but I'll always be the Mulder to your Scully. So I want so yes.
But square root of 2 is not even theoretically realizable, given what we understand about quantum mechanics and the fact that square root of 2 being an irrational number means that it is not realizable in reality, right? There's theory that we could describe reality really well with the square root of 2, but we couldn't make it in reality. And then there's real stuff like a horse, right? So truth, false, and one of the things that we take axiomatically for granted is all false things are unreal by definition. If we can show that something is a contradiction, we assume immediately that it's unreal, or that our theory is just totally out of the whack. You see what I mean?
Yeah.
So to clarify with some concrete examples, a true and real thing is a fact, right? A false and real thing is a counterfactual. A true and unreal thing is a myth, and a false and unreal thing is something like a fiction, maybe, right? Like just to kind of give something for people to grab onto. Okay, that's the end of my tangent.
Yeah, well, no, that's fine. I will say, in this channel, we define myth pretty differently, and those of you who've been watching along, and particularly the Tolkien section, will can CF those earlier episodes. Yes, I know what you mean, though. I know what you mean by myth in this context. I would personally never define myth that way, but that's fine. I'm not a mathematician.
Well, and of course, I'm not even like defining myth in terms of a.
I know.
That's why I say true and unreal, though, right? Because I'm not saying that myths are false, like an atheist would, right?
Exactly. Yeah. I will start fights with anyone about that, just because it's my favorite thing to fight about. Okay.
Exactly.
Yes. The nap does not apply here. That's trailer for an upcoming episode. Okay, yeah. So so I've sort of given a general sort of definition about like of what Barth kind of means, at least to the best of my understanding, by the term nothingness. But let's hear straight from the horse's mouth. You were talking about horses, and horses are real. Karl Barth's also real. Okay, so this, so I was just underlining the shit out of this because it's just so dense, but it's also so good. There's just amazing quotes in here. I think, of course, I'm a Barth fanboy, but it's okay to be a Barth fanboy. You don't have to be, but it's cool to be one. There's a few things I hear that bear reading, just to hear it from, again, a translated version of what Barth's saying. But again, this translation is pretty legit. So he defines nothingness in various ways, but one of the ways is, quote, "It is the antithesis which can be present and active within creation only as an absolute alien, opposing and contradicting all its elements, whether positive or negative." He also warns and talks about a lot about in this section about what nothingness does, how it works itself out in creation, or we could say in the world, at least in our experience of the world. And he notes that humans can fall prey to this nothingness. And that, quote, "We let ourselves be deceived by it, and we deceive ourselves. In this way, true nothingness erupts into God's creation. It is in this way we ourselves come to have a part in its nullity," which is an awesome quote. I think that's an awesome quote. So we can see here for Barth, nothingness is nothing, but because it's opposed to the things that are, in this case, creation, and ultimately God, but from a Christian perspective, we are all part of creation too, right? We are created beings, we exist, we do things, right? The reason we experience the world is because we exist. So that means that this nothingness is also opposed to us, because again, from a Christian perspective, humans are created in God's image. So while nothingness is ultimately going after God, it goes after anything it can get its hands on, right? It goes after anything it can get its hands on, particularly those things created by God, which include us. So maybe I'm interested to see how you interpreted this, Elliott, but I got a really strong sense of like a threat, that for Barth, nothingness poses a serious threat, or at least it can pose or could theoretically pose a serious threat. But even in his writing, there's a sense of present, to borrow a line from Tom Clancy, a clear and present danger of nothingness. Right? There's a clear and present danger of nothingness, that it opposes everything that exists now, has ever existed, or will ever exist. And that's kind of like a problem, right? Because if you're somebody who exists, and I like to think we all exist, I don't know if I can prove it, but I sure believe it. I like existing, and I know that time is, we do not live forever, but I enjoy existing while I exist, and I enjoy being in existence. And if there's this nothingness thing, and it, that's out to get everything that exists, that could pose a problem. That could be something that at the very least we should think about. So but yeah, and it's no accident, by the way, that I pushed for this, and it's beginning of October. As somebody who really likes Halloween and horror movies and things like that, I was like, yeah, hey, this is perfect, because this is all about the thing. Well, to quote Metallica, the thing that should not be, the thing that's the nothing that's coming, might be coming for you. I don't know. I dig that. It's kind of, I think it's theological horror, just a bit.
Yes. Well,
and
no,
and
this is sort of like Lovecraftian theological horror, right? Like it's actually it's beyond cosmic, right? Horror. It's like I don't know if existential horror is a category or whatever, or something like that.
Yeah, people say that Lovecraft is nihilist, and he is very nihilistic in many respects. But ultimately, in Lovecraft's world, the things that threaten humanity are things that they're elder gods that are somehow have existence somehow, and that blows our minds. We can't handle it, but somehow they're real. This is going beyond that. It's a really good point. It's like, yeah, those like Azathoth, the thing that, now technically Azathoth is supposed to negate everything, but he's still sort of like real in a way, right? In Lovecraft's world. This is like
He
goes
has a
one step beyond.
material existence.
Yeah, this
right?
is like,
this
oh,
is
this is the void.
right.
This is the
Yes.
this is like the Nietzschean void almost. But I mean, Nietzsche writes a lot about the void from a personal perspective. This is like the void qua void. Like this is
and
the vacuum of everything. Yeah. So.
Yeah, well, and I think that's a really great way of putting it. Very, very briefly, because I want to kind of like, because I just want to clarify between you and me, even like what Barth is meaning by nothingness or nullness or nullity, right?
Yeah.
The forces of null, if you will, and I mean that all caps null. If you're a computer person, that will mean a lot of stuff, and I can explain that, but I won't do it right now. Basically, this whole thought came up with the conversation that we were having, that I have, is like, I have I've identified at least 4 different levels of nothing, right? And
oh, that's right, your levels of nothing.
Them. Yes, just so that we could decide which nothing we're definitely not talking about here, right?
Yes.
So the first level of nothing is so this thought for me came from essentially pondering this ancient Greek statement, which is something can't come from nothing. And as soon as I resolved Zeno's, and not me, but as soon as I read a resolution of Zeno's paradox, which is Zeno is failing to understand how distance and time relate to velocity. And that's kind of like, basically it's like Zeno is a big dumbass, right? And it's okay, it's an easy mistake to make, but it's not a profound statement to misunderstand velocity, right? So similarly, I don't think
if you've ever gotten in a car accident, you've also misunderstood velocity. Yes. Oh, I can make
exactly.
I can make this turn in time. Yeah.
Well, you probably, you failed to understand momentum, probably,
probably more.
Anyway, so point being is that, like, so
for the non-mathematicians in the crowd, just bear with us, with us plebs. Okay, keep going. Yeah.
So something can't come from nothing, and I kind of realized in reading through Wittgenstein that actually you have a full carte blanche to kind of reject most philosophical paradoxes as equivalent to being really stupid language games. And by stupid, I mean like dad joke level kind of stupid, right? So Wittgenstein gives us this really great thought to say, hey, could you imagine how many centuries of confusion there would be philosophically if you had a language that, instead of saying nobody is there, nobody is in that room, you had to say Mr. Nobody is in that room, right? And that would probably lead to a lot of very confusing, unnecessary having to be like, so Mr. Nobody can have various forms. It's like, no, dude, just say that there's nothing there, dude. Like, so in the spirit of that, right? In the spirit of that, I was like, okay, so we have 4 levels of nothing. Nothing level 1 is essentially the set of things I'm thinking about times 0, right? So example, you might imagine a room with a table and maybe some chairs, but no other objects in that room. It would be totally reasonable to say nothing is here, meaning no pencils, no elephants, right? We all kind of recognize that the furniture is not what we're talking about, and so that's okay. And similarly, we could say nothing is in this room. We don't need to call out that there's a closet door, right? Like, we all know what we mean by nothing is in this room, except for the stuff that allows this room to be a room. Exactly, right?
Actually, yeah.
There's air particles.
There's
dust.
air particles?
I can see dust on the windowsill, right? Like, that's exactly what we are not talking about in level 1 nothing, right? We're just talking colloquially speaking. Okay, great. So then the second level of nothing is a physical vacuum, right? Okay, great. But there's another actually, which is like actually quantum foam, and it's like, okay, yeah. But we're saying that if we're going to be autistic about it, that the net, right, the total energy at every point is 0 for our time span, and that covers the quantum foam situation, right? Okay. Essentially, there's no material in there except for the background radiation of just existence in our universe, so to speak, right?
In space, no one can hear you scream.
Right. Exactly. And so that's what we're saying. There's nothing to scream into except for quantum foam. So then the third level of nothing is sort of no space-time but you still have the laws of physics. And I thought about this version of nothing when people are asking, like, well, what did the Big Bang bang into? Right. And they say, oh, well, the Big Bang just occurred through quantum fluctuations. And you're like, yeah, but like, why are we assuming that there's rules of physics, right, for there to be quantum fluctuations in two? If there was nothing, there's like, nothing, right? And so this third level of nothing kind of is the bridge between the vacuum of space, the laws of physics existing, and then that could potentially cause a material reality to exist. And then the fourth level of nothing, which is what I call nothing, right? Or essentially metaphysical nothing. There's no objects and no rules. And this level of nothing is really the most interesting form, in my humble opinion. But the other things are required to really clarify that this nothing, think about it like this. When somebody says something can't come from nothing, that is a rule. And that rule is true regardless of whether that rule exists or not, whether it's real or unreal. But if that rule is real in this quote unquote nothing, then something exists, namely that law of nature, which is level 3 nothing, right? So we know that level 3 nothing did not only have the rule of something can't come from nothing, because something exists, right? That would ensure existence is impossible. So we know that the level 3 nothing was not structured in that way. Level 4 nothing doesn't have that rule as well, right? So level 4 nothing, literally all bets are off. In particular, there's nothing stopping a reality from just occurring with no rules. And you're like, well, that doesn't make any sense. Like, of course it doesn't make any sense, because there's no logic there either, dude. So that's my explanation. It's probably heretical, but that's my explanation for saying God was eternal in the quote unquote past, because God being the existential thing, right? He's the first level 3 nothing that occurs from this nothing that then shapes the laws of nature, that then shapes the material reality. So I'll pause for
comment. That was kind of outstanding. I like talking to you, Elliott, because of this. Yes, everyone needs a math friend, particularly us non-math people. Well, I do. I mean, as a very much lay person, non-expert, who's very interested in, to use a fancy word, apophatic theology, which is not quite what Barth's doing here, but it's sort of tangentially related. Apophatic theology seeks to describe not what God is, but what God is not. Focusing on this sort of, like, to quote, I believe that's Julian of Norwich, the darkness of God, right? Like, what does that mean? From an apophatic, particularly Eastern Orthodox perspective, God doesn't exist. God is the ground of all existence. And while that is sort of snarky, and I have friends who are Orthodox who've used it in a very snarky way, but I appreciate it because it makes you think, like, wait. But yeah, it's like, don't you believe God exists? It's like, well, that would mean that God is created somehow. That God is material in our reality and therefore subservient to space-time, which is a huge deal. Well, that's some sort of weird kind of quasi-pantheist understanding of God, that God is somehow wrapped up, that God not only creates creation, but God somehow is also bound to create. Yes. Yeah, right. And which is not a Christian belief, or that is a non-Abrahamic belief, because none of the three big Abrahamic faiths, Judaism, Christianity, Islam, would ever hold to that. So that, and I think it's important, like, when we say, and this is my understanding, when I say God is supernatural, I don't mean fully separated from nature. I also do not mean bounded, quote unquote, below by nature, in the same way that a finite circle and an infinite plane defines that infinite plane as well, right? Your finite circle defines the boundaries of the infinite plane where it is not. And that's also not what I mean by nature. But I also don't mean that the infinite plane outside the circle and the circle are the same thing, because otherwise there would be no distinction or boundary. What I mean is that God is the coordinate system under which the infinite plane, on top of which we draw a circle that bounds the infinite plane outside of it,
and a finite circle inside of it, right? So, and that's not really a perfect metaphor, but I think it's a better direction to think about is that coordinate systems supports in a way that circle and that space outside the circle.
That's interesting. I have to keep thinking about it. I've never quite viewed God in that way. So I'll have to. I don't even know how to respond to that. I will continue to noodle that over. But it is
well. So I'll give you a brief motivation for why I think that that's not a crazy statement to make, and it comes through from what I understand is the Catholic understanding of the first mover. Catholics don't say that God is the first mover in terms of a deist understanding, like he initiated the first thing and then everything happened after that and he's got hands off. He's the first mover in that in order for something to move, like it's sort of like in order for you to get text messages, right? There first must be a cell phone tower, right? So it's sort of God is more like the cell phone tower than he is like, you know what I mean? Like he's actively providing the servers, so to speak, to have the platform of the universe exist, right?
It's the newest and best platform, and we're really excited to unveil it. Yeah, it's the beauty of God's creation. Sorry,
it's very secure. It's very secure. We haven't been able to hack it, but it's not at all private. God knows everything that's going on.
There's right, because God is sovereign, and that's the thing that we'll touch on in a few seconds here, because for Barth, so God as sovereign is a thing that all Christians believe, at least the vast. I mean, there's probably some weird sect somewhere that's like, we don't like that term because it's patriarchal or some crap. Anyhow, that rant aside, but there's differences. So different sects of any religion, in this case Christianity, have different beliefs, but I have found, and many would back me up on this, that a lot of the differences, for example, between like me as a Lutheran and like my Catholic friends, there's of course legit theological and historical differences, right? Like the Reformation was a thing. But a lot of the differences have to do with, you were talking earlier about, Barth's using these words in very particular ways. A lot of differences, I would contend, between sects of any religion have to do with, like, not only what a certain word or concept means, but how it's used in the context of the tradition. Why do I bring this up aside from it just being an important point? Well, so Barth is writing in the Reformed tradition, so a kind of Protestant that comes out of John Calvin's thought. In many ways, it'd be a topic for a future episode, but Barth actually uses Calvin against Calvin and Luther against Luther, which I find chef's kiss amazing, because this is a sign of a good thinker when you can do this.
Yes, exactly.
But he still very much is a great admirer of Luther, but he's not Lutheran. He's Reformed, Swiss Reformed. And so Calvinism, historically, and to this day, really emphasizes God's sovereignty. And you can see this reflected in all kinds of doctrines that we don't have time to get into today per se. So just hold on, Elliott. We'll get to it at some point. Things like free will and stuff like that, right? So sure. Free will is sort of a contentious issue amongst different kinds of Protestants, because there's various opinions about what that really means. Do you have it? If you don't have it, what does it mean? But all that aside, one thing I kept writing down in notes as I was rereading this section, I'm like, Reformed, underline, not because of so much of what Barth was saying, but because of his huge emphasis on, okay, God is sovereign of everything because God created everything that was created by God. God is sovereign. This is big thing. And I'm like, yep, this is clearly written from a Reformed perspective. I don't know. It's just a thing to point out. God as sovereign is a huge important idea, in all of Christianity, yes, but particularly amongst the Reformed. And we love the Reformed here. The Reformed have produced really good theologians, such as Karl Barth. Even though I'm not Reformed, I can look at that and go, yeah, you guys clearly know your stuff. You clearly think a whole lot. And if you follow any of the internet memes, the Reformed bros all have huge beards and just drink a lot of craft brews and wear plaid and talk about like 5-point Calvinism and stuff like that. Perhaps that's a too niche of a joke, but it's actually quite hilarious.
No, the AKA they're all hipsters, and
They're
as
kind
a
of all
hipster,
hipsters.
yes.
There's the Calvinist hipster thing. Yes. That is a joke, but it's also real. But why is that important for this discussion of nothingness? Aside from the fact that yes, Barth's writing from a Reformed perspective. Well, it's not just like he's using the lingo that his peeps used. It's everything about his view of what nothingness is grounded in the fact in a staunch belief that not only does God create everything, God rules everything as sovereign. Because it's really important, because when you're talking about, well, what is this nothingness thing? It's this thing that has no substance, yet it fights against everything that is. So you have to look at, well, who's in charge of what is? God is sovereign. What is interesting though, and I find this brilliant, just my opinion,
Right. Go ahead.
Is that this could easily, if you were not a super wicked smart guy like Karl Barth was, this could easily fall into the Gnostic trap. It could fall into a dualist kind of situation pretty quickly, where you have this big good God and then this nefarious evil God thing, and they're like duality, and it's the fight in the cosmos. And this is various religions in today, but also more historically, have reflected some sort of hyper Gnostic or sort of proto Gnostic, or you get like Zoroastrianism, which is full of this kind
Zoroastrian
of
is kind of where Gnosticism comes from.
Gnosticism comes out of that.
Exactly.
And we don't have time to get into the Gnosticism thing, because that's
no, for sure, absolutely not. It's out of the scope.
It would be very easy, I think, to fall into traps of like writing about Christian, writing a potential Christian view of what nothingness is, and falling into a Gnostic issue. In the history of the church, there's always been sort of the Gnostic problem of the people who go a little too far into the duality, a little too much into the separation between flesh and spirit, and you start getting funky ideas like Jesus didn't have a physical body and weird shit that is just strange. But Barth doesn't do that here, because Barth is writing about nothingness very well from an anti-Gnostic perspective, because he writes a lot about what nothingness isn't, which is just such a wonderful thing to say. What nothingness isn't. This is why I love humanities, because you get to think about things like this. What nothingness isn't. So for Barth, what is not nothingness? Well, nothingness for Barth is not the negative quality of existence, of creation. And so he gives lots of examples of this. But to sort of summarize that somewhat, because otherwise this
basically it's not the land of all unicorns, right? Like it's not a parallel universe that exists in opposition with ours, where all non-existent things exist.
But it's
right?
But also it's not the negative quality of the things that do exist. So for example, nighttime is scary, because even from an evolutionary perspective, that's when the saber-toothed tiger kills you, right? Or the prowler gets you, to bring a more modern American perspective to it. But Barth's quick to point out, okay, like by nothingness, we don't mean nighttime. We don't mean even, which is pretty cool, because he could have fallen into this trap. It is not even death.
Yeah.
That is a negative aspect of life. And we don't mean negative in a judgmental sense. We mean as negative as opposed to the positive, right? So there's all these kind of things. There's this yes, capital Y, and this no, capital N. If you'll allow me, Elliott, I'm going to read a quick section of this, because it's best from that horse that does exist's mouth. Yes. And I'm not calling Karl Barth a horse, but I'm just referencing Elliott's earlier thing.
Well, he doesn't exist anymore, but yes.
That's another do not sidetrack me, because that's a whole other conversation. Okay. So to quote Barth, it is true that in creation there is not only a yes, capital Y, but also a no, capital N. Not only a clarity, but also obscurity. Not only progress and continuation, but impediment and limitation. Not only growth, but also decay. Not only opulence, but also indulgence. not only beauty, but also ashes, not only beginning, but also end, not only value, but also worthlessness. So I found that very poetic. Clearly repping some Ecclesiastes here, right? For those of you that might know, this is like, yep, you're jamming. Again, he's like doing the jazz improv version of Ecclesiastes there, right? For everything there is, yeah. So he's quick and very adamant because he's Swiss. If you've met the Swiss, I love them, but man, are they adamant. Swiss culture is very adamant about things. Karl Barth is Swiss and Reformed, so he's like doubly, triply adamant about things. And he's like, okay, so when I say nothingness, I do not mean these negative things, some of which are bad, right? Like, assuming you don't have some serious mental issues, death is usually, you don't want it, right? Usually you avoid death, right? As a general rule, right? You're like, geez, I don't really feel like dying today, right? So I'm not going to do the crazy traffic move, to bring it back to the car accident thing. I'm going to be prudent, right? I don't like starvation. That is the lack of food. I'm going to try to get food today, right? I as a general rule, as humans, we like things to continue how they are, right? We want to be able to track the progress of something and then predict how it's going to be. We don't like unexpected things, right? We don't, as a general rule, like the nose. As a general rule, there are some no's that are maybe good, but I would argue, at least for me, maybe this is something about me. I like more the yes than the no. Really, I like to hear that things are going to be great and good, and everything's going to roll smoothly, and I'm never going to have issues, and there's never going to be some sort of impediment to my whatever, right? Okay, but that's not how the real world works, right? The real world is full of both yeses and nos. And what Barth is saying here is not that the no's are good somehow, right? He's not like saying, oh, death is just the greatest, right? Nope, he's not saying that. What he's saying is this negative quality of God's creation is not nothingness. That's not what we mean when we talk about nothingness, because even those negative things are things that are real. They exist. They happen. They occur. We experience many of them, right?
They are like the dual. Basically, it's sort of like trying to say that you have a coin with only one side, right? It's like the logical consequence of having day is night. Right now, of course, obviously, there's ways in which if your planet's not spinning, blah blah blah. I don't care. The point being is that if you have light, right? If you have light, then like and this is where I say the Genesis story is really critical to pay attention to what God does, right? Because I have since been like very confused by what people mean by creation ex nihilo, because I don't see that being supported in the Bible, right? Like that, that's just not existed in my mind, because there is waters of the deep over which God was having his spirit, and then he says to the waters, let there be light, and there was light, and through that speech he separated darkness from the light, aka he created a categorization of light and darkness, superimposing that on nature, and that came to occur. If you I'm saying sensible things, I don't know how much Barth actually disagrees with that.
And Barth talks about that. He talks about the creation, Genesis 1, and Barth's really quick to point out, and very adamant to point out, I do not mean, when it says, when Genesis says God created night and day, or separated night from day, depending on your translation, and I'm not a Hebrew expert, so, right, but depending on the translation, right, however that is rendered into, in this case, English, we do not mean the nighttime is the nothingness, right? What we mean, meaning what Barth means by nothing, is everything that was not created that God said no to, but an eternal no to, not a temporary no to, right? But an eternal, not only will you have a negative quality in my creation, but you just don't exist.
Right. And actually, could I bring up maybe a clarifying point? Maybe it's a distraction. So like one element of this is the ancient Greek idea, are the gods good, or are the goods God, right? And that is to say, is God constrained by logic? And the way that I rephrase this is, can God create a rock so big that he can't lift it? And the way that I resolve this is to recast that statement in can an unstoppable force move an immovable object, right? What happens when those meet? And my response to that question is to say, you fundamentally misunderstood how these two things are realizable, if they're realizable, in terms of like, if you make this statement, you're implying a physical constraint over how the unstoppable force can move. All we have said by saying what happens when an unstoppable object meets an immovable, or sorry, an immovable object meets an unstoppable force is to say the unstoppable force has certain trajectories where it cannot go, right? In particular, can't go on any trajectory that would put it on a collision course with the immovable object. And therefore, if we take this same analogy and roll it all the way back up, I don't think that God is constrained by logic. I think God at every moment chooses not to create a rock so big that he can't lift it and then lift it, right? Like he just doesn't even go there. I think that kind of scenario is in this nothingness. Correct me if I'm wrong.
No, you are right. And there's a quote. I like to quote from Barth, because not only is he just a great writer, I want people to read this stuff. Read Barth. Barth's a really good writer. Even if you're not Reformed or even Christian or even religious, just it's beautiful. It's beautiful thoughts. It's beautiful thoughts coming to work on the page. You could read it as philosophy. That's the cool thing about Barth, is that Barth is writing theology, and he's clearly adamantly writing theology, but he's clearly read Nietzsche, and he's clearly read Kierkegaard, and he's writing theology for a sort of a post-death of God world, so to speak.
For a modern world, right?
Yeah,
which is really critical.
For a postmodern world, which is,
well, I think he's pretty postmodern, but we'll get into that separately. What's the give me hit me with the quote.
There's many quotes. He says, so he goes, throughout this section of church dogmatics, he keeps coming back, right? He circles back. So what do we mean by nothingness now? Well, now we have more information. This is what we mean. Well, this is what we mean. So later on, he keeps going. You get more and more definitions of nothingness, but each one builds on the previous. It's really well done. Here are two little quick quotes that I think that jive with what you've been saying, Elliott. Nothingness is that from which God separates himself, and in face of which he asserts himself and exerts his positive will. It is, meaning nothingness is, and it's in quotes here, not as God and his creation are, but only in its own improper way, as inherent contradiction, as impossible possibility. So I think that's, I think that's kind of what you were saying there. I mean, maybe I'm wrong.
I think we're jiving. No, I think we're jiving because it leads to the second kind of question, and this is a genuine question. It's not even rhetorical, because I did only skim this, and you know Barth better than I do, which is how would Barth, because Barth talks a lot in at least chapter 4 about God and God's will being the sort of separating factor between the nullness, the nothingness, and what's real, right? And so my kind of question is, thing that popped in my head, I hadn't really considered that deeply before, is God constrained by his will? That is to say, is God's will superordinate to God minus his will as a being, right? Is there a proper distinction between God's will and God as quote unquote an entity, right? Or is God his will, or is his will a part of him that he always chooses to follow? And this gets back, by the way, to when you were saying God is a ruler, right? I take that as a pun, right? I take that both as he is a ruler in terms of like the person who,
you mean like a measurer?
Yes, like that is to say he rules not just as somebody who commands, but also as somebody who provides the fundamental structure by which you orientate yourself as well.
Yes. If I may, this is somewhat of a non sequitur, but it relates. So Barth did not say this, but one thing out of the Middle Ages is, in the Middle Ages, God was oftentimes seen as somebody, as the one who measures.
A great geometer.
And you can see this actually in Anglo-Saxon poetry, where God is referred to as method, which means basically the measurer. So this punny quality that you're jiving with here, Barth doesn't make puns with it, but what I'm trying to say is This is actually in the history of at least Western Christian thought, this measuring quality of God is very much a thing. So you're in good company. Ideologically,
and don't get me wrong,
philosophically.
like this is a very deep observation in my humble opinion, right? Because as somebody who is like an anarchist, we see governments being on the side of
you see. Yeah.
Well, I say
statement. I feel, yeah.
I feel, yeah. No. So anarchists feel that states, Christian anarchists might say it like this, where a state attempts to usurp God's authority as the ruler by doing stuff like ruling currency. That is to say, by putting currency into unnatural units of account that are in contradistinction to what God is trying to do, right? And so when I ask, is God constrained by his will? This is kind of like, well, hold on, is there, because the problem is that God is quote unquote simple. That means that he can't be broken up into subparts. But if we say God
last time, go watch,
quote unquote,
everyone watch that episode on the Trinity. Yes. Yeah.
Exactly, right? If we say God, quote unquote, acts on his will, if we're meaning that totally metaphorically, then I'm totally chill with that. But like, it's just like, since his will plays such a huge point in Barth, in Barth's theology here, I just want to really like understand what he means by God's will.
Well, I cannot speak to that from a perspective of, I'm not a Barth expert. So, and I'm not going to attempt to authoritatively say anything on that. I can surmise based on, but it will be heavily colored by my own belief. So again, I'm an academic. I always hedge, and people get angry at me. I'm like, no, you got to hedge, because otherwise you just make a fool of yourself. I think the way I view it is that God's will is like eternally emanating somehow, because I view God's will oftentimes as sort of not synonymous with, but similar to sort of God's energies, to borrow a Eastern Orthodox term. So God's love and energies that come from him there's a purpose and a direction to them, right? Like, from a Christian perspective, that is a core belief, that God does not randomly do things.
Right.
That is not, now we may experience it as random, because who are we to know what is everything, right? And who are we to know he who is beyond everything, aka God, unless he himself makes himself somehow, if not visible, somehow we become aware of him somehow, right? That's how I view it. And that's a very loosey-goosey, non-specific sort of Sunday school answer. Like Jesus? Yes. Well, technically that's true, little Timmy, but could you be any more specific, right? It's sort of one of these Sunday school answers, and I get that. But only because I would need to read a whole lot more before I could really give like what Karl Barth means by that. I do think...
No, and I think that's fine, yeah.
I think his answer would fall somewhere within that general category. I'm certain I will, you know what, Elliott, I will scour the rest of his church dogmatics, because I'm certain he wrote about that in there, because he wrote about he wrote about everything. So yeah,
and that's totally chill, because I think actually this whole thing is salient, because when Barth talks about nothingness bursting in, potentially a rupturing reality, I think that things like can God create a boulder so big that even he can't lift it? Those sorts of things are exactly the nothing that Barth is talking about, because if God admitted that into either his existence proper or nature proper, this would undermine his whole will, which has some logical constraints to it, meaning that his will is not inconsistent, right? His will is consistent. So since it's consistent, this does not admit, this separates him. He voluntarily separates himself for the sake of creation, right? From logical contradiction. Although I think that God is powerful enough to survive admitting logical contradiction, but if he admitted it in himself, this would potentially compromise reality, which he is all about making right now.
Yeah, I would just say, I think you and I would probably define logic differently, but that's probably a topic for another episode. Yeah. There's another quote, because there's just so many good quotes. I'm going to keep quoting. I hope that's okay. It's almost like I'm quoting from the thing we're talking about. Okay. He has another great quote that I think does sort of jive sort of with what you're saying here, or what you're talking about, what we're talking about here. It says, because so talking about like, well, okay, if nothingness is this no thing, how can it have any effect? How does it have any
Right.
potency, right? And Barth
Right.
says, for not only what God wills, but what he does not will is potent and must have a real correspondence. And by this, I mean, Barth means real in like the reality, like creation existent correspondence, like,
Yeah, not just
like,
truth,
like
but what is
like,
actual.
it's a pen, it's real kind of thing. Like, what is this real thing? Yeah. I clapped and it made a sound, right? Like this real, like what God does not will, what God says no to, and an eternal no to, that by definition, because it's God saying it or willing it, however you want to view that, it has something real to it. This is a whole thing in Christian theology. So you talk about, so there's like there's the left and the right hand of God, right? So you have the left hand of God are the things that God says no, or is the thing that God says no to, right? So the opus alienum Dei, which has the word alienum, alien. That's where we get the word alien from. Yeah. So the you could
to be separate from, to be unfamiliar with,
the alienating work of God, something like that, right? Like opus, like if you think of a magnum opus, this word in Latin. So it's like the things that God says no to. And then you also have
being huge work, I believe,
yeah,
right?
huge big work. Yeah, right. So the opus alienum Dei, the alienating work of God, something like that, the alien work of God. Then you have the right hand of God, the things that God says yes to. So the opus proprium Dei, right? So and Barth uses these terms, right? So he's using these Latin terms. And
which by the way, I wish he had used the Latin terms for left and right as well, because the left in Latin is sinister and right is dexter. So literally it's like, oh, this is a sinister quality. That is exactly aligned with this and everything that is left-handed. And this goes into deep occult stuff too, where if you say something is sinister, it's literally left-hand path, which Aleister Crowley also does. This is a whole rat hole, but I just want to bring up that actually literally everybody's agreement by left and right.
Yeah.
It's crazy.
Yes. And of course, I will say, we don't mean that people who are left-handed are necessarily, we don't mean it in this like hyper autistic literal sense. That's a common superstition well, it's not so common anymore.
But I do mean it to apply to lefties in terms of political left. I believe that lefties are both sinister and they are priests of Cthulhu in the sense of they are on the side of nullness. Right? Well, if you really drill down on what lefties want and you ask them like what they really want, annihilation is really what they desire at every level of the philosophy.
Yeah, I think this is something I hope one of us would hit on, and this is something I would very much like, Elliott, if you're up for it, to explore in another future episode, because this was what popped into my mind too. Yeah, there's
not to say the left are necessarily the forces of Satan proper, because
we don't
think
mean
this
that.
Nullness is Satan, but yes.
And Barth also doesn't say that nullness is Satan. He has his demonology is very interesting. He's not talking about Satan per se here. He's talking about this thing that is not, meaning both N-O-T and N-A-U-G-H-T. I did a pun there.
Right.
The thing that is not, yeah. But that's really what he's talking about. Now, of course, works of evil would fall into that, but this is a broader, and forces of darkness would fall into that. But it's a much broader category.
I also don't understand this nullness to mean that it is in any way, quote unquote, a ruler in both senses that we've talked about of Satan himself, because it seems like this nullness, and again, not to be Zoroastrian about this, right? If you have God on top, I would say that nullness is like a little bit down and to the left, and then Satan is like way further down and to the left, right?
I have to think about that. I don't know. I don't know. I'll have to think about it. But so this thing that is alien is on God's left. What is the thing that is on God's right? Right? That's grace for Barth. And
literally Christ, by the way, in the Bible.
Grace as given and perpetually derived from Christ. Yes, for Barth. and so, right, Barth talks about, grace being the basis and norm of all being, the source and criterion of all good. So in order to have this, right, so God says yes to this thing. And so from a Christian perspective, he eternally says yes to Jesus, to make it sound a bit like a Sunday school answer, but that's theologically checks out. So if he's perpetually saying yes to these things, ultimately to grace, what is he saying no to? Well, all this nothingness stuff. Why does nothingness have any force at all? Because God is saying no to it. And what God says and what God's wills is important, right? And is eternally powerful. Like that it really, from a Christian perspective, it really freaking means something, right? So yeah, that was just the thing I wanted to point out. That yeah, there's God's left hand, there's God's right hand. It's interesting, yeah, because from Lutherans have a similar kind of thing, right? But not so we have a similar sort of concept. Luther was sort of playing with this left-right distinction, but more in a broader sense of like the left hand and right hand parts of God's kingdom, like, right, so that like there's which is sort of would be an interesting thing for us to roll with, Elliott, actually in a future
yeah
episode.
that would be interesting because
Luther
actually there's kind of a question in my mind.
Yeah.
Is like, so if Christ is God's left hand in the kingdom of heaven,
Right.
I know this is like wildly heretical, but I would personally put Judas as on his left hand.
You mean that Christ is on his right hand?
Yeah. Sorry, Christ is on his right hand. My bad. Yeah. Sorry. Yeah. So to clarify, if Christ is on God's right hand, then Judas is on God's left hand. Why? Because for Christ to be crucified, he had to be betrayed by someone, right? And Judas happened to have been that someone. And so it's like, well, it was the will of God that Christ was betrayed and delivered to Pilate. Now, of course, I know that's wildly heretical. I'm just saying, bro, who would be on God's left hand if not that?
People always forget that Christ was betrayed by more than one person.
That's
and
true.
Peter is the one who's Peter is an interesting figure, because Peter very much, even though Peter doesn't start the betrayal per se of Christ, but he also completely denies Christ 3 times.
He perpetuates the betrayal, right? And actually, though, realistically speaking,
it's interesting.
What would his non-betrayal have done? Right.
Well, everyone acts like this is somewhat off topic, so let's not get too far down it. But
go ahead. Yeah.
I always bring up just Peter, even as just a consider this sort of thing. Consider who also betrayed, but consider the different outcome. Again, probably a topic for another episode. But yeah, no, it's there's an interesting kind of, again, and there's a yin and a yang even to the betrayal qualities of the crucifixion story. So
because you have the traitor betrayer, and then you have the loyal betrayer, right? In that case, right?
Or the repentant betrayer.
Yes,
because betrayal is betrayal. Because because betrayal is betrayal, right?
And by the way, I think about treachery and all of this stuff in terms. Actually, it might be worth. I didn't even think about this, but I think another wrinkle or another way to like approach this nullness or nothingness is to first consider Dante's Divine Comedy, and specifically the Inferno, right? Because I feel like as you go down the levels of hell, you get further from the grace of God. That is to say, more alien from God, right? And so it's interesting to note that treachery. So the way that Dante's Inferno's 9 circles of hell are laid out is that they're in 3 parts of 3. Right. And within each 3 parts, they are laid out in terms of sin against the self, sin against others, sin against God. Right. And the first 3 are a little bit not, but definitely the last 6 are 100% like this. So you have treachery against your own kind, right? Treachery against, a broader notion of humanity, and then treachery against God, right? Where Satan is in the center of chewing on Judas and then some other people Dante didn't like.
Right. No, very good to point out. I will just say, and I'm not even saying this to negate anything you just said, but Dante's Divine Comedy is a wonderful, beautiful work of the Western canon. However, there is a propensity I have noticed to use it as sort of a theological source, which I always caution people against. Not against using it. You didn't do this. You used it as an allegorical sense perfectly.
Yes.
But it's not a source of theology, nor should it be. So I just always question, like use it as and the allegorical sense it's intended for, and roll with it, and it's fine.
It's not even apocryphal. I've
heard descriptions of hell from Christians. I'm like, that's actually just Dante. Like, that's not ever. Like, I've heard descriptions or things of hell where I'm like, that has never been part of Christian teaching ever. And it's clearly just Dante, and people don't know that. And because I guess I have a colleague of mine says, most of what people think about hell is from Dante's Inferno and the Dilbert cartoons. So there's there might be something to that,
which is not inaccurate. And insofar as like one. So firstly, it's an epic poem, obviously. But what I realized So it is literally poetic, and I think that's worth considering. Right. And so the second thing is the way that I like to think about it, I think it's a brilliant way of sort of embodied philosophy. So insofar as obviously it's not canon, but one could probably make it canon by, just like the spheres of angels and the choirs of angels, blah, blah, blah. That's kind of embodied canon in my mind, insofar as the bits that are canon, right?
Yeah, I just bring that up as a nota bene, please note. Yeah, lots of Latin in this episode. And you know what? That's good. We like Latin here. Okay, so at the end of this section, Barth really starts talking about, okay, so I've described to you this really alien. He uses the term alien quite a bit. I don't think that's on accident, right? It's strange, it's bizarre, it's foreign, not in the like the South Park they took her jobs kind of really dumb
foreign
sense. It's
foreign. Well, it's worth knowing where Barth was in history, and the term alienation in both the Marxist and the Nietzschean sense exists in the philosophical canon, and that's the way in which I kind of read it. You see what I mean?
I mean, I read it more in the classical Reformed / even you could go back into like Western scholasticism of the Middle Ages kind of sense of like that. Okay,
how does that differ from
that which God pushes? It's not alien in the sense of it's coming from somewhere else. It's alien in the sense of God alienates it, pushes it away. Says no.
Well, no, but I think actually Marx does use it in that terms of like when he's like the workers are alienated from their labor, it's like they are literally pushed away from the fruits of their labor by the industrial system, right? Like they're separated from their labor in terms of their labor becomes an abstract force that they cannot fully realize themselves, right? Because the structure of capitalism, right? Requires that they do only one little bit, right? And anyway, I don't mean to get in on the communist whatever the heck, but it's worth pointing out that's what communist means by alienation as well, right? Like a pushing away.
Yeah. Well, and there's an interesting thing if you're interested, Elliott, in doing more Barth, writing in the mid-century, having been involved in the Confessing Church, Die Bekennende Kirche in Germany, which was elements particularly of the German Protestant churches that said no, speaking of alienating works, said no to Hitler in a philosophical sense, but also in a literal sense. They were involved in assassination attempts. So there's that. There's all sorts of things we can make of that. It'd be fun.
Well, no, and I think actually potentially maybe another twist on this is that if you're familiar with like the libertarian mythological tradition, there is this notion of nullification.
Book of Rothbard, right? Chapter 1, verse 12. Yes.
There is no philosophy outside the nap, and Rothbard is its prophet, right?
Yes,
but anyway,
yes, essentially, yes.
That's my like end cap confessional, right? Is like I feel like it's very succinct.
You know what, Elliott? I will say this is almost like an evangelical confessional myself. I used to be right there with you, and then I realized the folly of my ways. And there is hope. There's hope on the other side. You're amongst friends here. We support you.
Well, of course. Like there's Muslims, right, who don't wear hijabs. You know what I mean? I'll just put it at that. But
no. There's various interpretations of every doctrine, whether it be political, philosophical, or religious, or anything.
Exactly.
There's various ways to live out any belief system, is what this is true.
Yes.
But
To not be totally derailing from what we were talking about, which is basically just to say that oh god, I'm forgetting too. Sorry. So get us back to our track.
We'll retake the reins. Yes.
Yeah.
So what is to be done with this nothingness? It's a problem. It's like a big problem. Okay.
Oh, sorry. It's like nullification. It's like nullification, like jury nullification. I think that's an example of nothingness rupturing into our government system, right? Because it's literally creating a notness. It's negating the law. It's an eternal. It's a yes when or a no when the state wants it to be a yes.
Maybe we'll do the political in a future episode. Let's just sort of get to the kernel.
Yeah, go ahead. Keep going. Yeah.
Things first. Yeah. Cart before horse type situations here. Yeah. So what is to be done with nothingness? And it's this interesting thing where at the end, the last little section, the reality of nothingness. Barth talks a lot about so how are we to react to nothingness? And so of course, we are to say no to it, right? Because because first and foremost, because God says no to it. So of course humanity is supposed to say no to it. Now we don't always say no to it. There's this whole problem called sin that exists in the world of people say yes to things they shouldn't and vice versa, right? It's this problem. Sins are the things you do, sins are the things you don't do, right? Sins of commission, omission, these type of things. But of course, we're supposed to say no to it. I mean, first and foremostly because God says no to it. But also, by the way, if you care about existence, creation, yourself, any sort of goodness, well, of course, you also should say no to it for all of those reasons. Because nothingness is negates everything that is. Or at least that's what it attempts to do. But ultimately, so, you could read this entire work, I think at least, this is my take on it. You could read this entire section of the Church Dogmatics up to this point and be like, wow, I think Barth might be a nihilist. That sounds exhausting, to quote the Big Lebowski. Yeah, it is exhausting being a nihilist. He sounds like a nihilist a bit, maybe a bit. But at the end here, of course, he is true to his colors because he's a Christian. And he's like, well, the reason we even get the glimpses or the glimmers, or we have some sense of what this nothingness that's invading God's creation is only because the nothingness, the not, right, das Nichtige, has already been knotted, has already been negated. Who does that? Of course, it's a Sunday school answer, but this is what Christianity is all about. Jesus, right? Right? Christ negates nothingness in death, in crucifixion, death, and resurrection, and then that's why we see it. So this fear that we could maybe get, and it's cool because I don't think Karl Barth's trying to be a horror writer, okay? But if you bear with me, as somebody who's a horror fan, who's also a theology fan, there's a lot of really good horror in Christianity. It's the right kind of horror. It makes you scared about the things you probably should be scared about, from my perspective, my belief, right? Death is a problem. I don't like that, right? Destruction of the good is a problem. I don't like that, right? Up until this point, you can be like, man, this is just so dark. There's just nothing here. Literally, there's nothing here. This is a grim situation. But Barth leaves you in typical kind of Protestant, broadly speaking Christian, but particularly Protestant fashion with this, but that eternal no has already been completely knotted in the sense of NAUGHTED, if I can spell. It's already been knotted. You recognize it because you have, at least from a specifically Christian perspective. And again, he's writing to Christians here, right? Because you already see its destruction. It hasn't been, it's been complete. It's the present and coming kingdom, to go back to the soul sovereign thing, right? The present and coming kingdom of God. It's already been established. It's already here, but we are seeing it more and more. And even though there is evil, even though nothingness attempts to butt its head into our world, we can see it as nothing, capital N, yeah, because we see what God wills. We can see what God alienates because we see what God pushes forward. It does not end in nothing. It does not end in nihilism. It's actually the opposite in the end. So it's really cool because, again, throughout this work, this section of his work, it would have been really easy. I mean, I'm speaking from, I couldn't do this. It would have been really easy to fall into the Gnostic trap. It's a trap. It is a trap. Avoid. Avoid. It's Admiral Akbar warned us all those years ago, and none of us have listened. Avoid the Gnostic trap. Also, avoid the nihilist trap, because both of them, not only are they just kind of poopy, in my opinion, but they don't give you anything to work with and will lead to sort of a deep despair. Like, avoid both those things. And he reminds you at the very end, like, by the way, the reason we can even properly talk about nothingness in this way is because it has already been negated. White pill at the end there. For the people who read all the way through this section, you're rewarded at the end. So that's just that's how it finishes up. What did you think, Elliott, about that last section? I'm curious.
Okay, so firstly, I mean, just to address the nihilism point, it's interesting statement to when somebody says, "Oh, nihilism sounds exhausting," and I say, no. Nihilism is the logical consequence of exhaustion, right? Like, if you find yourself being nihilist, you have already been exhausted, and so the route out of nihilism is to refresh, right? To inexhaust, to unexhaust yourself, right?
No, a very good point. Yes.
Right.
Do not have your girlfriend cut off her toe and attempt to extort somebody. This is what we learned from Big Lebowski. It doesn't work very well.
It doesn't work for you, right? And so, like, blah blah blah, like fear and trembling, no doubt. Anyway, point being is that Kierkegaard, like, this is what's ridiculous about, like, Nietzsche, right? Nietzsche is declaring God dead, but, like, freaking Kierkegaard already gave us the way out of it. It's just that the principalities and powers, wink wink, want God to be dead, right? And so it's sort of,
that's a good pun, sir. Hats off to that pun. That's a very good pun. I like that.
So anyway, so that's the first thing. And then the second thing is, like, I'm a little bit confused on this point, and I'd love to get your clarification, which is, like, okay, so here's the thing about it though, because in terms of, like, nothingness, right, or nullness, if we will, he says that it's possible for it still to burst forth into God and to something. And he does this correlation basically with like, we are sinful when we're sinful in two ways. If we actually cause Cthulhu to exist, that's a sin. If we attempt to call Cthulhu, that's a sin. Now, the thing is that from a Christian, and the reason why I say that,
Barth doesn't say, this is Elliott's very well-crafted Lovecraftian analogy here. Barth does not talk about Cthulhu, but I wish he did. Yes. So we're doing it now.
Yes.
So roll with it. Okay,
We're right. Elliott's philosophically off-roading, right? But basically, like, we like,
we like philosophically off-roading, but yes.
Exactly, right. Yeah. So there's a sense in which, and it depends on which level of analysis you're talking about. So the reason why I say the Cthulhu stuff is to just really clarify what I mean by the following sense, which is, it's a sin to attempt to do magic, and it's a sin to actually do magic. Now, from a Christian perspective, like, depending on your denomination, magic is literally impossible, right? Not just like a bad thing that you shouldn't do, it's also not possible to do. Here's the thing, depending on your denomination, right? Because the Catholics will say you could do magic. The only way you could do magic.
Where are we going with this? Because I'm losing it.
No. So where we're going with this. Yeah, where we're going with this is that basically, is it that if Christ has permanently defeated nothingness, right? How is it that we could possibly sin in such a way to cause nothingness to potentially come into reality? Or is the sin attempting to pull, nothingness into reality, even though that's actually impossible, right? It seems like,
I do feel I can answer this one pretty conclusively from having read other sections of Barth.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, it's the attempt.
Okay, it's the attempt. So you could not, in reality, call Cthulhu, but attempting to call Cthulhu is a big no-no, right?
Well, Barth would never say that sin doesn't have real consequences. And actually, in a little bit earlier in the section, I'm trying to find. Yeah, can I quote this? Because this is Barth's words. This is Barth's words. This is Barth's words. I'm going to say this because this is
the word of Barth.
The word of Barth. Why do I make this so clear? This is Barth's words because this is for reasons that I think people who watch this channel will probably get. Okay, so Barth's talking about earlier in the section. Okay, Like the problem is that nothingness has been knotted, correct, but it doesn't mean that it doesn't have form. It doesn't mean it doesn't do damage. It does a lot of damage, right? That's like saying, well, our sins, do we believe in the forgiveness of sins? Yes, therefore it's good to go do whatever you want. Okay, that's dumb, right? Like, please don't do this, like, as much of the times as we do this, please, still, this is not what you should do. And so he's talking about, he talks about the dangers of demythologizing, Barth's words, nothingness into some sort of, oh, it is but a fleeting shadow. And he's like, the only reason the shadow is fleeting is because Jesus died and was resurrected. So please don't make this cheap grace, to borrow a term from Dietrich Bonhoeffer. Yeah. And so he talks about how, a sinful person, we're all people, he talks about, quote, he cannot interpret his sin as mere retardment, unquote. I love that shit. Incredibly based. This is Barth's words, incredibly based. Like, sin is real, nothingness is this unreal realness that's dangerous. The attempt to do the nothing, the attempt to, as you quite nicely say, call Cthulhu, is not only bad in the sense that, geez, you shouldn't do that. It's like calling in nothingness, while it will fail, does do damage. The attempt is damaging in a, perhaps in a metaphysical sense, but in some cases, like a physical sense. Like, murder is bad. Okay. Like, running around doing that causes real physical problems of people dying. Like, that's a problem. You shouldn't do that. I mean, I know, brave to say, I know I'm going to come out and say murder's bad. I'm against it. Stunning and brave. But no, like the attempt of the nothing, while it ultimately has cosmically failed and will cosmically fail from a Christian perspective, it's still like bad, and it does damage creation, whether that be us or the world around us, or however you want to, in the truest, broadest sense of creation. So that's how I interpret Barth. It'd be like, don't do it.
Okay.
A, because you shouldn't, but B, because it does damage. Like, don't do it.
Okay.
Yeah.
So if I could give a metaphor that may be totally wrong, and that's great. So if the previous state prior to Christ's death, which of course is a problem because Christ died in both directions in time, but never mind that. Point being is that, like, you're
going all Back to the Future. I mean, just keep going. Yeah, make the point.
Well,
yeah,
it doesn't have to be internal in just one direction. That's my point. Point being is though, is that, like, okay, if Christ's death, essentially prior to Christ's death, there was a vacuum of space outside the window, right? So if you threw a rock, boom, everything gets sucked out into space. Post Christ,
explosive decompression's a problem. We've learned this from many movies. It's
right, and
problem.
so Christ essentially puts the atmosphere, or puts the ship on an atmospheric planet. So now you break the window, and like, it's not that you're going to suck out in the void. It's just that now you've broken a window, bro. That kind of the?
And yes, and property destruction is wrong. I'm going to go here. I'm going to stick to your ANCAP nature. Property destruction is wrong, and if God is the one making the windows, well, you shouldn't break any windows, particularly God's window. It is his window. Why are you doing that?
Attempting, so essentially the sin is going against God's yes. To attempt to choose the no is also the issue here. So
it's also going against God's no.
Yes, right.
Yes.
You're touching God in his no zone.
You people.
Hashtag NSFW.
Mach mich fertig, to speak some German. You make me crazy. Okay, yeah. No, yes. I again, I'm not a Barth expert, but having read other whole sections of Barth, I would that's how I would. That's my take on what he would say. So
okay, no, and that's fair. I think that's okay. Fair enough. So I mean, so nothingness is a problem, but the only, I mean, he's adamant in the reason we can even have this conversation right now, and the reason he can talk about it in this way, to even properly see it, is to see it for what it is. It is not the negative qualities of God's creation. It is something alien to God and God's creation. And you see this from a Christian perspective, through Christ's work
in the broadest sense of work, everything that Christ ever did and continues to do. So, and Christ in not just in the incarnate sense, but in the capital S Son sense. But please watch our previous video all about the Trinity. So, yeah.
So if I could just do like a tiny appendix that I wanted to bring up earlier, but maybe it's good. I don't know. Is that okay?
That's fine. If it's bad, I can always remove the appendix. It's
exactly.
It's a fairly easy procedure.
Perfect.
Yeah.
Well, because I want to talk about what is, right? Because people get very confused on this point.
Okay, Bill Clinton. Okay, yeah.
I know, right? It turns out it does matter what your definition is.
Please, yes, what is really important, but please do not listen to what Bill Clinton has to say about anything, particularly philosophy.
He's definitely a liar.
Yes.
He is like a meta liar. He's a liar at every level of reality. He is definitely trying to cause the nullness.
Yes, like Cthulhu is coming through. Yeah. All right. Yeah.
So there's basically three different types of is, right? That the problem is in English, these are way overloaded in a programmer sense. So the first one that we think about is sort of a definitional is, right? And so that is to say, is, aka one member of a collection, right? So if I say X is in A, right? So X is an element of A or X is A, I'm saying a particular member of a collection of members, right? So Collin is a human is an example of this, right?
Except when I'm a level 5 night elf, but that's only on weekends. So continue.
No, that's a very postmodern of you. Okay, there you go. So then there's another same sort of definition, which is A is a subset of B, right? That is to say, a particular collection within a collection that already exists, right? So all A's are B, aka humans are animals, right? So it's just another version of definition, right? Okay, fine. Right. Then there is a relabeling, right? Which is to say X equals Y. That is to say, what is on the left-hand side is the same thing as on the right-hand side. So two names for the same thing, aka a human is a Homo sapien. You don't really get much out of it except for to understand what these two words mean in the constellation of words to which the two belong, right? So Homo sapiens, science, human is humanities, right? But we're saying the science and humanities join at this point where we're referring to the same thing through this two different labels, right?
Yeah.
And then there is.
I'm not anti-science. I mean, I'm a humanities bro, as this whole channel is a testament to. But I mean, I'm all about the olive branch, man. I'm fine with that. Oh
no, for sure.
Yeah.
And yeah, we just have there's just certain words that map back and forth, and maybe both work just great. It's just like anyway, regardless. So and then the last one is a categorization scheme, right? Or an equivalence class, right? So we say X is equivalent to Y, not equals though, right? So two potentially unequal examples from a same category, right? So Collin and Elliott are both humans, even though we are not the same human, right? So those, right? So those three sort of general categories of like identical to, equivalent to, and is a member of, right? We all mean is by those, and we use is in different ways. We use equality and equivalence and subset essentially to define each other in careful ways. But like when we say nothing is not a thing, right? Like it's important to keep in mind that like is has these three different things hiding behind it, and that we don't want to get confused about what we're meaning by is and is not, even though like throughout a word, a sentence in English and German and every other language, these sorts of things happen. You see what I mean?
Yes. Would it surprise you to know though that actually a lot of languages in the world don't have a word for is?
Yeah, because is kind of not very good. It causes a lot of problems.
The point is only to say that you don't. Those of you who've watched the episode on sort of this Chomskyan idea,
English minus E
to not have the word to be does not mean you don't talk about existence. If anything, it underscores your point that any form of the verb to be can mean a lot of different things, and actually you don't even need a singular word for it to talk about existence or non-existence.
Right. And the problem is having to be as a conceptual thing, right, immediately invites a huge problem, which is Wessel's paradox. And what Kant talks about, it's caused all sorts of unnecessary confusion in the Western canon, right? Which is does exist, right? Is real. And then you're like, fuck, guys, like, you done fucked up, right? Because this is where like basically this is where Hegel is like, oh no, it's becoming, it's not blah blah blah.
Oh.
I'm like, oh my god, we fucked up.
Elliott,
Like,
Elliott, I love this, but we cannot end the episode. We cannot end it on Hegel because I fuck Hegel. So
I hate Hegel. He is the prophet of nullness. I swear to God.
He is Cthulhu's prophet. Okay, yes. Yes. Let's think of, yeah. So anyhow, what did you, so I, of course, I was pushing for us to read this. I really like this. Every time I read this, I get something new out of it. I think about it in a different way. I would never claim to understand it perfectly. I don't. But the sign of a good text, of a good thinker, is that you, every time you read them, you get a little bit more out of it, but then you're simultaneously more confused. It's something to, it's a sign of a deep thoughts happening. I don't know if I 100% agree with Barth on this, but I really like his way of talking about nothingness. And again, this very particular kind of nothingness. And I love that he spends so much time really defining what nothingness isn't. That's one of my favorite parts of this, is that he spent so much time talking about that. And that's, part of the reason why we spent so much time today talking about what nothingness isn't, because that's important, right? Like, it's not to say that the negative aspects of creation aren't bad. Anyone who's lost somebody they've really loved, anybody whose a loved one has died, is really like, you would never walk around and say, isn't it so great that, right, such and such a person died? Like, no. But that was a thing, sadly, that was going to happen, right? Like, nobody gets out of here alive. So there are negatives in creation that suck, but there's something deeper and darker than that. And that is this nothingness. And that was, when I first read this, not to get too autobiographical, but when I first read this, I had just lost somebody in my family. We had a family death that was really unexpected and really hard to deal with. And it was actually kind of, in a weird way, again, to talk about, theology, good theology is pastoral care. Barth, who's also since sadly died, back in the 60s, was able to reach out through time, through his work. And it was a consolation to me to be like, okay, like, death is really awful. Cancer fucking sucks. But it doesn't have, not only does it not have the last word, it's not even the big bad. There's worse things out there. And if God is taking care of the really worst things, the no thing, well, okay, it gives you perspective for your life. And that is perhaps a little hallmarky at the end there, but you know what? Sometimes we do a little bit of hallmarky. I like to leave everybody with a white pill at the end, right? There's a white pill on the pillow. Please enjoy. It's minty fresh.
Well, and that's kind of what I through my thoughts of analysis, right, is that people get pretty dark pretty quick because they're not very precise about what they mean, right? So sometimes people will be like, oh my God, what if, it's just so, since something can't come from nothing, like, there's a good chance that nothing could have existed. What if God didn't exist? Blah, blah, blah. I'm like, no. It's metaphysically impossible for something akin to God to not have existed. So you don't even have to worry about it. Like, it's nonsense to even say. Yeah. So it's okay, right? We've just thought ourselves into a nonsensical situation. So you don't have to be that afraid. Be afraid, but just not that afraid, right?
Well, and if you're thinking yourself into a nonsensical situation, oftentimes, the best solution, and I don't follow my best advice here, but oftentimes the best solution is to just, in the immortal words of Bob Newhart, stop it. What are you, crazy? Stop thinking that way. Think in a different way. Yeah. Again, one of the greats, Bob Newhart. Cool. Well, Elliott, I think that's a pretty good white pilly, minty fresh way of ending what could have been a very depressing topic, but we don't want to leave people in that place, because that is where the nothingness starts to burst through. Don't let it.
Yeah. Don't let it. Without darkness, it would be hard to see the light, right?
Yeah. Yep. Without nothingness, it would be hard to see the somethingness. So
exactly,
Elliott,
right? It would be.
Yeah.
Oh, I actually have stuff to plug this time.
Plug the things.
So it's currently there is level 1 nothing there in my but I do have now a Substack that is called the Pawnbroker of Ideas, which is a play on Hayek's secondhand dealer of ideas. I'm like, oh no, I'm not even as cool as the freaking as the freaking intellectual elite who are secondhand dealing in ideas and corrupting them. I'm straight up like, this may or may not be a stolen idea, so I'm pawnbrokering it.
Cool. Yeah, it's a gray market of ideas, if you will. Yeah.
Exactly.
It's a gray market of ideas. Cool. Yeah, I'll link to that in the chat. Anywhere else? Anything else you got going on, or is that pretty much where people can find your soon to be not level 1 nothingness? Is that where that's where we
Correct. I will put something there at some point. That's a placeholder for stuff that'll be there in the future at some point. I'm sure that I'll post, like, basically I'll start posting backups to certainly our conversation. So I'll post the article that I wrote that's kind of waiting in the wings for the level 4 nothing. If you want to read like a little bit more detail, if that wasn't totally obvious here, yeah. I've got some backups, so I'll definitely post it there. So that way you got it, and I'll post I'll post articles from what I was thinking about for our conversations at the very least, to kind of give you additional stuff to chew on, because it is tough to really get into all the details of everything as we're trying to have a light, airy survey of some of these topics.
Oh yeah, we're cutting out a lot of stuff that like each one of these episodes, there's a ton of stuff. I have to alienate, I have to left hand a lot of things away in order to bring out the good stuff. Yeah, you have to kill your darlings, so as they say in writing. So yeah, Elliott, that'd be awesome. You'll allow people to give people some more resources to dive in if you want to. Yeah, and everyone can follow me on Twitter if you want. You don't have to, but if you want to, you can. At Altphilologe. I know it's a German word, and you're like, what the heck? I'll type it out, put it in the description if you want. I post things about, I post libertarian and post-libertarian things. I know Elliott's already bristling. I post lots of stuff about Tolkien and Chesterton and, good, solid British people talking about goodness and hobbits and things like that. So there's some of that as well. And yeah, I guess like, comment, subscribe, all the things. Elliott and I will be doing more talking about interesting things coming up. We have many things in the works, a pipeline, if you will, and this one has not been sabotaged, so we hope it remains that way. And
it does not necessarily end in the alt-right.
It does not end in the alt-right. It does not. And we will see you all next time. Everyone, have a good rest of your Sunday. Take it easy, and yeah, peace.
Bye.